All right, so this year NCOSS and a coalition of peak bodies commissioned a series of reports to quantify the long-term impacts of bushfires, floods and the pandemic over the last 3 years in New South Wales, focusing on the impacts of those on the wellbeing of people. And wellbeing is such a weird expression, and it's very, very hard to sort of quantify it. But this report does. It's the Aftershock series, and there's 4 reports which each look at the groups and locations that have been most affected, and particularly the flow-on costs for mental health, for domestic violence, housing insecurity, which of course we hear over and over again, child wellbeing and development. And collectively, the reports paint a pretty grim picture of already vulnerable households doing it tougher, further entrenchment of disadvantage and the significant costs to families, to individuals and of course to communities if decisive action isn't taken. The report also puts forward practical reforms that will make a positive difference for the people who've been in the firing line and for the New South Wales economy. And I think it's a really important conversation to have because we hear it again and again. It's like it's really expensive every time these things happen. It's like, well, we need to start putting things into place because that's not going to change, and the costs are sometimes quite hidden as well. And this report actually unhides those costs, if you like. So joining us to outline these findings is Dr. Angela Jackson. She's the lead economist with Impact Economics and Policy and the author of the Aftershocks series. She's got expertise in the distributional analysis of labour markets, disability, health, gender, housing and fiscal policy. She's the author of several major reports and was recently appointed to the Commonwealth Grants Commission. So be nice to her. She appears regularly in the media, writing for publications like The Conversation, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Australian, and as a guest on TV and radio programs like The Drum. So I'd like to welcome Angela to stage.
Thank you and good morning. I'd like to start today's presentation just by acknowledging that that's not working. Yeah, sorry. By acknowledging country. I am from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, but today we meet on the lands of the Gadigal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and specifically acknowledge all the Aboriginal leaders in the room today. In addition, I accept wholeheartedly the invitation that was offered by the Uluru Statement of the Heart and commit to working towards making sure that we can enshrine Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice in our Constitution. Now, in terms of what I'm going to talk to you about today, they're very, very personal topics. They are topics that go to the core of who we are. As an economist, I obviously come in and I try and put a number on those experiences, on that hurt and on that pain that people within New South Wales have experienced over the last 2.5 years. I really want to acknowledge that that can seem incredibly insensitive, and that for many people today, particularly those with lived experience, hearing a number put on that experience can make it feel like, you know, you're really diminishing what that means. We do this for a reason though, and we do it, number one, as an economist, it's kind of what we were trained to do, but it's because it's the language of decision makers. And unless we can articulate what the economic and social costs of these events over the last 2.5 years were, it's very difficult to convince decision makers to invest today to mitigate those impacts. But that doesn't mean that I know that it does have, you know, a significant impact on people here today, and some of the issues that we're going to talk about, people have had personal experience of. So I just want to acknowledge that. Now I'm going to try. Oh, it worked. Now this series would not have been possible without, number one, Joanna at its helm in terms of leading at NCOSS, but a variety of peak bodies from across the sector. Leaders who provided their time and expertise, both in terms of what had happened in the last 2.5 years in their community, but also a wealth of experience generated over their careers. So I really want to thank everybody that was involved, everybody that provided feedback, case studies, photos. It wouldn't have been possible without you. So what did we set out to do? Well, we really wanted to look at what the impact had been in the last 2.5 years for the people of New South Wales across these key domains of wellbeing. So we looked at mental health, domestic and family violence, housing stress, child wellbeing and development. Now there are others, but we had to keep the scope within something that was achievable. We drew on international literature about the impact of particularly around natural disasters. And so what does the theory say about what the impact could be? What's the previous empirical literature say? And then we looked to gather the best available evidence about what had happened in Australia and what had happened in New South Wales over the last 2.5 years. Now, as always with data, there's always new data coming out. And the reality is that even at this point in time, I think it's pretty early for really comprehensive data to be coming out about these impacts. So we will get a better picture over the next 12 months, 2 years, even up to 5 years potentially, when we'll see the true impacts, for example, at the next census. But we wanted to at least have a go, because the reality is investing today will help mitigate these long-term impacts. And so if we don't have a go at trying to quantify what they are, it's difficult to then justify the greater investments that are clearly needed to mitigate those impacts. So as I said, we looked at mental health, domestic and family violence, housing stress. Those reports are out and published and have got great media run, with Joanna leading the way. And we have one final one that I'll run you through some of the final results of, that will be coming out later this week, on child wellbeing and development. So in this presentation, I'm just going to give you an overview of the dot points of the major findings to give you a flavour. It is a bit depressing, I think that's fair to say. But I think when you read the reports, what's also in there are the stories of how the communities have responded. So we have a lot of case studies in terms of the way, for example, Aboriginal controlled health organisations have responded, housing organisations. That makes it a little bit more uplifting. But the bare numbers are not fantastic. If we look, for example, at mental health, we can see a 46% increase in the number of 12 to 17-year-old females presenting for self-harm or suicide in New South Wales from 2018 to 21. They're harrowing statistics. We can model the fact that there was at least a 21% increase in the number of people in New South Wales experiencing depressive-like symptoms within 2021. That's a huge increase. And that will have a massive impact in terms of lost productivity and participation alone. We know that when people are experiencing poor mental health, they tend to participate less in the labour force, and their productivity also tends to decline. So we can quantify the impact of this increasing incidence of depression and anxiety in the community at around $7.4 billion over a 4-year period. That's a huge cost, a huge economic cost. And we can also start to have a look and start to have a think about, well, what are the policies that could mitigate some of those impacts? And again, we kind of know what works. The evidence is pretty clear about the types of interventions that can improve mental health within the community. One area where New South Wales really does underperform compared to the other states is in terms of community mental health funding, where in New South Wales you fund around $54 less per person than the national average. So what we call for in the report is increasing that. We know that community mental health funding can really drive better mental health in the community, reduce acute service use, and help lift productivity and participation. And we also need to think about those step up and step down services as well, ensuring that, you know, people both before they go into an acute setting, that there's somewhere else for them to go, but also as they're leaving that acute setting, when we know it's a critical time in mental health care, that there is that support provided. And again, it's an area where, compared to some other states, we can see New South Wales has underinvested. We did do some comparison with Victoria in terms of that mental health funding. And while there has been this increase in New South Wales of about 20% since the start of the pandemic, in Victoria it's actually been 36%, and that was off a higher base. So you can see that really there's been this underinvestment in New South Wales, particularly given the need. Family and domestic violence. This is something that did get a lot of prominence at the start of the pandemic. There was an acknowledgement, I think, that the nature of lockdowns, the nature of forcing people to stay at home, the additional stress put on families was likely to lead to an increase in family and domestic violence. What we've done here is take some of those national studies about incidents and said, well, what would this mean in New South Wales? And we've modelled that there was at least 60,000 additional women who experienced family and domestic violence during the pandemic, and 46,000 who experienced an escalation in that violence. Again, big numbers. That is a lot of women in our communities who've experienced additional violence and new violence for the first time as a result of the pandemic. And we know that there will be long-term impacts, both in terms of potentially ongoing violence, but also the trauma that that will cause for those women, and they need additional services. So in terms of, again, looking to Victoria, which we know previously when I first started working with NCOSS, we could never do this, compare to Victoria, but now with the bromance, we're allowed to compare to Victoria, which is a good thing. We're looking at, in New South Wales, an additional $485 million a year to match what's happening in Victoria at the moment in this area. These are big investments, and what that says is there really is an underinvestment in social services in New South Wales. We need, of course, and there's previous work done on this space, to increase the investment in social and affordable housing. More work that was done this year really highlights the fact that for women, when they've experienced family and domestic violence, they're too often faced with the choice of poverty or violence and of homelessness or violence. We need to change those choices and give women that secure housing that they need when they're leaving those violent relationships that simply isn't there. Too many women are going to specialist homelessness services, having experienced family and domestic violence, the biggest group to be seen, and there's no long-term support for those women. And that means often they face either homelessness with their children, which is not a situation a lot of women want to stay in necessarily, because it also has safety, obviously, implications, and then you see women having to return to that violent partner. We can provide another choice, and it's just about investing in that social and affordable housing. Housing security was possibly the most frustrating one of the 4 reports, mainly around data and the unavailability of it. We're getting better in terms of the census and what would be available. But what we could see is, in terms of obviously rising rents, has been a huge issue, particularly in regional New South Wales. And what that has driven is not just an increase in the number of people experiencing housing insecurity, and that's what we define as spending more than 30% of their income, but a huge increase in even those who were already in housing insecurity, so already spending more than 30%, going into extreme income insecurity and spending more than 50% of their income in regional New South Wales on rent. Now, this is the problem, obviously, that is across every front page in the country at the moment, and we're now seeing these rent rises infiltrate Sydney and Melbourne markets as well. This is, I think, the issue of 2022, 2023. People not being able to afford a place to live, and increasingly having to face, alongside other cost of living pressures, extremely difficult situations in terms of their housing security. Again, we need to look at building more social and affordable housing. I think one of the things that sort of happened within the report is we often call for a number, but I think it's true, and as the sector moves to say, no, what we want is a percentage of new stock, it probably is a much smarter way to think about it, also from an economic point of view, that you just need a basic level of your housing stock to be social and affordable, to act as an anchor in the market of rents, and also to ensure that it's keeping up with demand across the community, which simply, I mean, it's incredibly evident has not been the case in the last 20 or 30 years of policy in this country. Immediately, though, an increase in rent assistance will help. That is a federal policy, but it is something, I think, if we're talking about easing cost of living pressures in the upcoming budget in a way that is targeted at those that are most impacted by these rising cost of living pressures, it is very clear that it is people in rental accommodation who also tend to be more low-income earners. And the final report, which will be released on Wednesday, is perhaps the most profound. I'm a mum of 2 kids who went through the pandemic in Melbourne and missed, close to 6 months of school. I can see the impact the pandemic has had on them, and they're from an affluent household. They go to a high SES school because we live in a high SES area. But even for us as a family, I can see that this has had a substantial impact. And you talk to teachers and they'll tell you kids are 1-2 years behind in terms of their social development. In terms of what we've seen already in the data is a real spike at the start of 2021 in terms of the number of kids developmentally behind nationally when they're starting school. So 13.4% increase, which is a big increase, right, year on year. And a statistic that we'd expect over time to be getting better as more kids access early childhood education and care. We did the stats on this, and this was quite an interesting, intricate bit of analysis to try and work out where the lockdowns were in New South Wales, what schools were affected, and what were high SES and low SES schools. And we were able to quantify that there are around 220,000 students in New South Wales who are attending low SES schools, and they missed on average 15 weeks of face-to-face learning over the entire pandemic period. Now that might not sound like a lot, but if you think, an average school year is around 40 weeks, it's almost half a year. So it's a significant amount of schooling on average. And that is going to have an impact. So we know, and there is varying evidence on this. We have the NAPLAN results, which didn't show a huge impact from the 2020 shutdowns, but then we have the check-in assessments, particularly here in New South Wales, that did show an impact. And other analysis of NAPLAN, which did show that for lower socioeconomic kids, there was an impact. Internationally, we're seeing a lot of evidence around the impact of the loss in face-to-face learning is having on kids' educational outcomes. And we know that will flow through to future earnings. Those links are very clear in economic literature around, the amount of schooling that you have, around your educational attainment, and over what that means for your life course on average. And so from that, we can quantify that this loss of learning in New South Wales is going to equate to about $16.3 billion in lost lifetime earnings. Now that's huge. It's also heavily concentrated in Western Sydney. I don't have it here, but you'll have to read the report when it comes out. But the list of local government areas in terms of those facing the biggest loss are in Western Sydney. And I think from the discussions we had earlier today, that is something to really think about, that an area which did suffer some of the worst of the lockdown, and you can expect also to have mental health impacts on top of that being significant, that these are the kids that have faced the biggest losses. They're from some of the lowest socioeconomic areas in Sydney. And what are we going to do about it to help those kids catch up in the years ahead? What we're calling for here is continuing to fund high quality, and I say high quality. The school tutoring programs that were rolled out, it was good, and it was a good investment from the government, but it wasn't, as often happens in education, rolled out in a structured, necessarily evidence-based way. If we're going to spend this type of money, we want to make sure it's working, and we want to make sure we're getting maximum effect. So yes, let's continue this additional funding, but let's make sure it's backed by evidence. And also around early intervention and protection services. There is a trial which we highlight in the report going on with NCOSS involvement, or are you running the trial or? Around this idea of wellbeing schools, of schools of hubs, of having the wraparound services. And this is something that in Victoria, again, is government funded and quite expansive in terms of the number of schools. This is really reimagining the way in which we support families and communities and the way in which schools operate, and taking, I think, us to the next level in terms of that service integration to really wrap services around children and the family, using the school as the centre of that. And I think it's something that would be great to see the New South Wales government get behind and fund more pilots in this space and not leave it to NCOSS to be running it. Yeah. So that comes to the end of the 4 reports. In terms of where we go to from here, there is going to be new data and information coming out, and it's going to require us and others in this space to continually evaluate and see what have the impacts been. We all want to forget the pandemic, I understand that, but we can't forget its impacts, because if we do, they will have lifelong consequences. So we need to deal with the aftermath of or the aftershock, as the series said, of the pandemic. Using the best available evidence we had to mount the case for additional investments today, I think really explaining to government they have an opportunity for early intervention here. It's much better to invest now than to wait 5 or 10 years when these problems become entrenched. The time to invest and to expand these services is today. And finally, I think for the sector is to tell your stories. As I said in the reports, they do come out. It's not all doom and gloom. But really, you are the strongest voice for the people impacted by the pandemic and the people of entrenched disadvantage in this state, and ensuring that you use that voice to advocate for them is also really, really important, which then segues nicely to the panel where we are joined by a group of leaders from across the sector to sort of talk in more detail about how the pandemic has impacted different segments of the community.
I think what's so great about this, and it's a really important tool for any of you in this field, is as much as it's grim, it's how to get government's attention. It takes it from being sad to being economically bad, and when things are economically bad, all of a sudden people in government pay attention, and then it gives really clear solutions. So if you can do that, tell your stories, get them emotionally involved, and then give them something they can stick on a bloody spreadsheet, because politicians like that and the people who deal out the money like that.